Good morning. Bienvenidos a nuestra celebración del centenario de Miraflores. Welcome to this symposium, Miraflores at 100 del pasado al futuro. I'm Kathryn O'Rourke. I'm an architectural historian. I teach in the Department of Art and Art History at Trinity University. It is a pleasure to be with you all on this beautiful day. Thank you for being here. I want to thank very especially Katie Erickson and Sabina Carr and the staff of the San Antonio Botanical Garden for hosting us this morning. They made this wonderful space available at very short notice, and I am extraordinarily grateful. I also want to go over just a few things before I introduce the symposium. First, I want to share with you the warm greetings sent to us by Mayor Nurnberg, who is unable to join us, but who welcomes us great success this morning. I also want to let you all know that, of course, we have a book coming out very soon by my co-organizer and speaker, Elise Urrutia, Miraflores, San Antonio's Mexican Garden of Memory. The pandemic has delayed its publication, but you may pre-order it during the break or after the symposium just outside of these walls. I also want to acknowledge several people who have been very important here. Certainly Elise herself and her family, who have done so much to make this possible, along with all of our speakers. And I also want to thank in particular Dr. Tomás Ybarra-Frausto, who wrote the foreword, yes, to Elise's book, and who is my friend, and of course, who continues to give so much to our city and to our country. I am so honored that he is here with us today, so thank you as ever, Tomás. Finally, I would ask please that because some of the images are copyrighted, that you not record the symposium just out of respect for the intellectual property of the speakers and the artists and photographers. So I am very, very happy to be joined by a wonderful panel of speakers and presenters. You see our schedule here, and I just want to note also that we will have to vacate this space no later than noon for another event. So I will encourage you to continue our conversation if we need to on the lawn outside in the shade. I just want to let you all know about that right now. Okay? All right. So as we gather today to talk about a garden in the heart of 21st century San Antonio, but with deep roots in Mexico and in that country's past, I am mindful that we speak the languages of colonizers. I invite us to recognize that this land was peopled and tended long before it was spoken about in Spanish or English, and to recall that the borders and boundaries we know today are both recent and mutable. What is your Miraflores story? Like some of you, perhaps I first encountered Miraflores in a car, zooming east on Hildebrand. At the time, I had just arrived in San Antonio and was writing a book about the history of Mexican architecture. It was the tiled mosaics on the Spanish colonial revival-style gates that captured my attention. At almost too high a speed, my husband and I veered into what was then the AT&T parking lot, and I jumped out of the car to look at the gates. What I saw astonished me. At the base of the Talavera-style mosaics were two phrases. Hernán Cortés founded Mexico City, 1521. Dr. Aureliano Urrutia founded this institution, 1921. What institution? The garden was an overgrown lot with difficult-to-see objects of some sort. And who was Aureliano Urrutia? What could he possibly have to do with Cortés? Before I even began to answer those questions, though, I was hooked. Here in San Antonio in the 1920s, someone called Aureliano Urrutia had imagined this place as related to Mexico City and to the conquest of Mexico 400 years earlier. It was precisely this kind of imagined historical connection that I was researching, and I knew that I had stumbled on something extraordinary. Before he immigrated to San Antonio in 1914, in the midst of the Mexican Revolution, Dr. Urrutia was one of Mexico's most prominent surgeons and briefly served as Minister of the Interior. After a modest upbringing in Xochimilco, he rose to prominence in a society sharply defined by race and class in cosmopolitan Mexico City during the regime of Porfirio Diaz. Like countless immigrants, when he came to San Antonio, Dr. Urrutia brought critical pieces of his cultural and personal history with him, integrating them literally and metaphorically in a new landscape. The garden he created in Miraflores was one of several settings in which he amassed an extraordinarily complex collection of objects that evoked aspects of Mexican art history and culture and stretched back through the 19th century, through nearly 300 years of the viceregal period and into ancient Mexico. That collection included the things in Miraflores that you've probably seen. The concrete copy of the Nike of Samothrace, an allusion to the famous Hellenistic sculpture in the Louvre, and to its reinterpretation atop the column built in Mexico City in 1910 in commemoration of the centennial of Mexican independence. Urrutia's Nike once stood atop his house, the Quinta Urrutia, on Broadway, where Intercontinental Motors was later built. Or Luis Sanchez's sculpture of the Aztec leader Cuauhtemoc, reminiscent of a sculpture that around 1900 stood in Mexico's great art school, the Academy of San Carlos. Or the works of faux bois by the master Dionisio Rodriguez. Or what remains of benches and garden furniture decorated in glazed tile. Or the inscription that refers to Fray Pedro Gente and the founding of the first great art school of the post-conquest Americas in 1530. Urrutia's collection had been begun in years before he left Mexico. It grew and evolved in Miraflores, the Quinta Urrutia, and in his downtown office. Today, Miraflores is radically altered, and for most of us, it is almost impossible to imagine what the garden looked like in the second quarter of the 20th century, when it was the site of gatherings of all kinds, from family parties to garden parties attended by the city's elite. After several changes of ownership, now Miraflores is part of Brackenridge Park, but also its own distinct place. We are here this morning to reconstruct some of the story of that place and to look toward its future. It is a story worth knowing about because it is about us and about this city and this country. It is a story of immigration. It is a story about how culture is understood, transferred, and translated. It is a story about how the past is imagined in both broad and very personal terms. And it is a story about land and landscape. Despite the efforts of many, including the landscape architects at RVK, the Brackenridge Park Conservancy, the City of San Antonio, historians Patsy Light, who I'm very happy is with us this morning, and Mariah Watson-Pfeiffer, archaeologist Christy Ulrich, and researcher Mary Beth Tomka, the Miraflores story is also a story of neglect and loss, a fact that is plain to anyone who looks. At some level, that neglect belongs to all of us. Today, as we dare to imagine a different future for Miraflores, I hope that part of what we ask is what we have neglected and why. After 18 extraordinarily difficult months, in a city in which inequality is so great and need is so deep and vast, perhaps it seems a bit precious to gather on a Saturday morning in a garden to talk about a historic garden that was private and idiosyncratic. But this is precisely the time to turn our attention to Miraflores. Over the last year and a half, we have been reminded repeatedly of the power of nature, whether as virus, flood, or even snow, and of nature's deep power to restore and rejuvenate us. This fall, we Texans find ourselves locked in deeply fraught arguments about immigration, about how history is taught, and about personal and collective power. Gardens, like history, help focus us on the big picture, on our interdependence with each other and with nature, and the finitude of our time here. Through the pain and the division of these many months, nature has remained the great universal. Dr. Urrutia also knew well its healing power. Miraflores sharpens our sights on the unfinished quality of two of San Antonio's greatest projects. Over about the last 20 years, we have restored countless miles of parkway and built trails along our river and creeks. We have restored ecosystems and made the extraordinary natural beauty of our city and county more accessible to more people than ever. Although imperfectly, over the last 100 years, we have embraced an image of San Antonio as a multicultural city, whose special richness resides significantly in its many connections to Mexico. And yet, at the heart of this city of parks and trails sits a neglected Miraflores, a garden along our river, designed and realized by a Mexican immigrant, that symbolically reaches across borders and time. It languishes as an unintended symbol of our incomplete work, of the histories and the divisions we have not faced, and the stories we have not yet embraced. But Miraflores also sits as the promise of the story not yet written. It is poised to help complete a great network of green spaces that run through and beyond the heart of San Antonio. Like Alamo Plaza, it is an invitation for us to reconsider how we understand the past and to state clearly what we want the future to be. As many of us have been reminded in these months, to create, restore, or care for a garden is to imagine beauty yet to come. Finally, embedded deep in Miraflores is a family story that stretches over at least 4 generations and across 2 countries. Today, 100 years after Miraflores was founded, the garden is in part the story of a father and a daughter, both of whom I am so pleased to have with us this morning. And I want also to acknowledge parts of that family who are joining us via live stream from many places. And let me find my list here of where they are. They are in, good morning, Houston, Mexico City, Guadalajara, Alabama, Florida, California, South Korea, where it is the middle of the night. And of course, we welcome also friends in Xochimilco and the Sisters of Charity of the Incarnate Word. I now have the great pleasure of introducing and welcoming our first speaker, Elise Urrutia. Elise Urrutia is a writer and explorer of her family's history, especially the life, work, and legacy of Dr. Aureliano Urrutia. As a teenager, Elise first ventured in to photograph Urrutia's disappearing family garden. After exploring the family history for a number of years, through her father, Dr. Aureliano Bud Urrutia, Elise's journey has taken her deep into ancestral territory and inspired her to rebuild through words and pictures her great-grandfather's lost landscape, while unearthing his message of cultural heritage as communicated through this once beautiful and expressive place. Elise received her degree in English from Colorado College and lives in San Antonio. Her talk is Miraflores, Dr. Aureliano Urrutia's Mexican Garden of Memory.
Good morning.
Good morning.
I want to start out by thanking my father, Dr. Aureliano A. Bud Urrutia, for his generosity to me as an explorer of my family history, and also for his generosity to Kathryn, her work as she started out as a young scholar exploring this garden. You helped us both to begin to consider this topic, and we are grateful. So, that's all this is. Until the end. Okay, so welcome. I'm going to give you a short biography of my great-grandfather, Dr. Aureliano Urrutia, in the context of his garden, Miraflores. You cannot go to this garden. The land is there, but the garden, with most of its features obliterated or in ruins, is but a shadow of its former self. What is amazing is that 100 years after its founding, people are still talking about it. Why? I've spent the last several years recreating the garden in words and photographs. And what I didn't realize is that I would learn so much about my family's cultural heritage. What I learned is that as impressive as Urrutia was, the garden was its own work of art. I call Miraflores a Mexican garden of memory. The idea is broad. What's left of the garden today belongs to San Antonio. But why is it a Mexican garden? And why is the element of memory important? Dr. Aureliano Urrutia created his private garden, Miraflores, after the 1914 loss of Mexico as his home. The landscape, fashioned by Urrutia from 1921 to 1962, was a multi-layered metaphor for Mexican history and tradition, presented visually through landscape, architecture, and art. The garden sat near the source of the San Antonio River. The garden presented a view of Mexico from his eyes as an exiled Mexican of the Mexican Revolution, which occurred from approximately 1910 to 1920. Because he could not return to Mexico, Miraflores became a way for Urrutia to transfer his attachment to Mexico to San Antonio. A reflection of his personal experiences and memory, yes, but also by extension, an expression of Mexican identity, a view of Mexico as a diverse nation, a complex homeland, a mixing of peoples. Because of this, the personal becomes a bridge giving us views of Mexican cultural heritage. Aureliano was born in 1872, Xochimilco, Mexico, a pre-Columbian agricultural community central to Aztec culture. The town is now a suburb of Mexico City, a World Heritage Site. It contains significant archaeological remnants of ancient culture for centuries. Here you see the early 20th century Xochimilco. Its unusual water-based agriculture of canals and man-made islands certainly inspired aspects of Miraflores. You can see the similarities between the early 20th century Xochimilco on the left and the Miraflores landscape on the right. Urrutia's mother, Refugio Sandoval, clearly of indigenous descent, passed away soon after his birth. His father, Pedro Urrutia, perhaps ran a bakery or a molino on the square in the town. A molino is a mill for grinding corn. Although it was highly unlikely for a child from a family of such modest means, Aureliano's precocious abilities gained him entrance to Mexico City's most prestigious high school, Preparatoria Nacional. There, he met and competed with the children of Mexico's elite. It's still in existence today. He received top national honors at his graduation from President Diaz himself, who you can see signed the diploma. And President Diaz then sponsored Urrutia's military and medical school training. This is Urrutia in about 1895, age 23, in his military graduation uniform. Urrutia later honored the memory of the former president at Miraflores. Urrutia's education endowed him with a core value for the liberal arts, an influence which is expressed throughout the garden. This bust of Diaz, prominently displayed at the end of the main drive from Hildebrand, mysteriously disappeared from the garden in the late 1970s. In 1897, Aureliano married Luz Fernandez, served 2 years in the medical service for the Mexican Army, and settled into private practice in 1899 at age 27. The marriage to the blue-eyed Luz fulfilled a valued union of indigenous and Spanish. This combining of cultures, called mestizaje in Spanish, is distinct and a permeating aspect of Mexican heritage and is also reflected at Miraflores. At the turn of the 20th century, as Mexico emerged as a force in science and industry, Urrutia's surgical prowess gained him recognition as one of Mexico's top surgeons. At the age of 28, he was appointed head professor of surgery to the Escuela Nacional de Medicina de Mexico. He was the first, at least in Mexico, to study physiology and anatomy using human cadavers, which was a practice at the time that was beginning to advance the field of medicine greatly. By 1911, he built a modern hospital complex, Sanatorio Urrutia, on 25 acres of land in Mexico City. This is in a suburb called Coyoacan, which is now, it was its own town, but now it's a suburb of Mexico City. The hospital had numerous large pavilions and was landscaped with several thematic gardens. Incidentally, Frida Kahlo's father, Guillermo Kahlo, lived about a 15-minute walk from the sanatorio, where the Urrutia family lived. Frida and my grandfather, Adolfo, were born within a year of each other, each in their own family homes. Guillermo Kahlo photographed the sanatorio, this is his photograph, as well as filming a number of Urrutia's surgeries. The two men clearly knew each other and certainly shared a love of gardens. The sanatorio opening was attended by Mexico's interim president, Francisco León de la Barra. Let's see if I can do this thing. That's him. Also was attended by Francisco Madero, which he is over here. This is Urrutia's wife, Luz, and here's Urrutia over here behind the hat. So the opening was attended by these people and their large families and other prominent dignitaries. The Sanatorio Urrutia came to have a reputation as a teaching hospital, but it also functioned as a salon for intellectual discussion. Urrutia's circle of friends, influential writers, historians, musicians, lawyers, artists, and doctors, congregated there to explore the most engaging topics of the day. The discussions reflected a philosophy of interconnectedness, that in order to be healthy, people must be nurtured by many disciplines. This approach became an important part of Urrutia's life: science, art, religion, nature. Urrutia felt that all these elements were essential to recovery in an era that had not yet discovered antibiotics. In 1912, the doctor reached the pinnacle of his Mexican career, becoming the director of La Escuela Nacional de Medicina de Mexico. Here he is with colleagues from the school. Unfortunately, in 1913, the idyllic setting of Coyoacan belied the impending chaos and anarchy of the era called the Mexican Revolution. Ironically, as a young surgeon, Urrutia had saved the eyesight of a young General Victoriano Huerta, and in the summer of 1913, the same man became president of Mexico and appointed Urrutia as Ministro de Gobernación, which is essentially like Minister of the Interior. Huerta's regime was characterized by his increasingly erratic behavior and ineptitude. The overthrow and murder of Francisco Madero, a withdrawal of United States support, and the collapse of the federal army, which threw the country into great violence and chaos. Urrutia, who came into the cabinet several months into Huerta's 17-month presidency, resigned after less than 100 days in office. Disillusioned and in an effort to dissociate himself from Huerta's disastrous political activities. Urrutia tried to remain in Mexico, but 8 months later, in May of 1914, with the country disintegrating, he fled to Veracruz with his family, under threats of death from both Huerta on the one hand and Huerta's opposition on the other. The family was intercepted by United States troops and were sent as the only passengers aboard a military ship to Galveston. After arriving in the United States in 1914, Urrutia rebuilt his medical career. He built a practice which largely consisted of patients from San Antonio's west side, but also attracted patients from around the US and the world. He also built a 10,000 square foot Spanish-style mansion, La Quinta Urrutia, designed by a lifelong friend from Mexico, which sat among 5 acres of gardens. It's his first garden in the United States, with fountains, benches, and sculpture. a hint of the gardens to come at Miraflores. Luz ran the house adeptly and was known as one of the best-dressed women of the Southwest. The 4 boys and 7 girls, all born in Mexico between 1898 and 1911, attended local parochial schools, learned English, assimilated into San Antonio life. But even with all of this, Urrutia's feeling of separation from his beloved home country was profound. Then, in 1921, Luz died at the age of 42. And this seems to have triggered Urrutia's activity of developing Miraflores as a way to transfer his love of things lost. He purchased the land and a month later began the work, almost immediately. Later that decade, he dedicated an area to her memory, forming a small peninsula which he called La Isla de Luz, with a sculpture at the far end of the pond of a woman carrying water. These features at the southern end of the property are no longer in existence. Miraflores was more than 1 mile north of Urrutia's house, completely separate. The garden property is inside the red oval at the top. The house property is seen in the smaller green rectangle at the center screen. This area of town reaches back to the origins of San Antonio as a city in 1731, when Texas lands belonged to Spain. Urrutia's garden revealed his passions for themes of Mexican history and culture. That he created a garden which references Mexico in so many ways is incredibly unique and inventive. And the fact that he did this in El Mexico de Afuera, outside of Mexico, makes it all the more interesting. Everything in Miraflores, the plants, architecture, sculpture, and artisanship, together formed an atmospheric landscape, reflecting Urrutia's deep understanding of Mexico. He commissioned Mexican artists and artisans. The sculptures and fountains evoked various Mexican aspects and ideals, and he planted species native to Mexico. By the end of 1921, at least one artist, Luis Sanchez, had finished a sculpture for the garden, and the tile gate towers on Hildebrand were built. By 1923, a small guest cottage, the Quinta Maria, was present on the property. And in 1924, the Urrutia Arch was completed. This gate now resides at the San Antonio Museum of Art. It is a collaboration between several artists, including Luis Sanchez and Dionisio Rodriguez, and also includes the early use of authentic Mexican talavera in a San Antonio landscape. Urrutia also expanded his offices during the 1920s, building his clinica at the top right, and his farmacia, shown below, with family members standing at the center. Those are several of his daughters and sons. He and his family worked there until the properties were destroyed in the downtown urban renewal of the 1960s. Also around this time, and especially during the Depression era, Urrutia served as a leader in Hispanic community and political action, raising funds for medical needs, engaging local officials, and influencing the Chamber of Commerce to admit Hispanic businesses. Urrutia remarried in 1925 to Catalina Tazer, and they added 4 more children to the family. Urrutia would marry twice more in his 103 years and have 1 more child, for a total of 16 who made it to adulthood. The growing Urrutia family often enjoyed Miraflores, and that's my grandfather at center on the bottom picture. Urrutia entertained friends, dignitaries, journalists, and others as he continued to design and edit the landscape. This is the leadership of the 1931 Conference of the American Institute of Architects. These are visitors from city government, including at right the Mexican Consul General, Enrique Santibáñez. This is Majestic Theater founder Carl Hoblitzel, and Maria Asunsolo, aka Dolores del Rio, famed Latin movie star. Urrutia is at the right. In the next several pictures, I want to show you some of the landscape that no longer exists in the garden. These missing elements present significant challenges to restoration, not only because of the cost, but also regarding what type of intention and attention the garden will receive. There are many ways to restore, and we are by no means assured of an authentic restoration. One major non-extant feature is this 3-story tower. Urrutia called it La Torre del Califa, the Tower of the Caliph, which recognizes the Islamic cultural influence in Spanish culture. This tower, plus Mexico's tradition of colorful talavera used throughout the garden, both stem from this influence. This photograph shows 3 aspects of Miraflores that are non-extant today. Its flora, its water features, which were quite extensive, and this amazing 22-foot high sculptural fountain by Dionisio Rodriguez. None of this is present in today's garden. This is an area at the southern end of the garden where Urrutia entertained large groups. The pool, the viewing platform, and the stepped seating in the left photograph are all non-extant. The platform that the photographer is standing on is still extant at Miraflores, but behind that was this peninsula, La Isla de Luz, and this pond with the sculpture in the back. None of that is extant today. So everything you see in these pictures is not at Miraflores. Finally, there were a number of talavera benches created by Urrutia as a ribbon of color which wove its way through every section of the garden. A few of these benches barely survive today. These are not all of the non-extant features of the garden, but I encourage you simply to realize that although there are some items remaining, most of the garden has literally been obliterated by time, as well as active neglect and destruction. To date, the small restoration efforts that have been made cannot possibly keep up with the pace of the decay that is taking place. The weeds that grow aggressively in this landscape year-round cannot even be maintained to a sufficient degree. And they're an ongoing, hugely destructive force on what is left of this fragile landscape. I'll end on a more positive note to tell you about the name of the garden and circle back to Dr. Urrutia. The name of the garden, Miraflores, does not have a literal translation. It's a stylized word, which is used specifically in Spanish to indicate a place. For Urrutia, it is many things. It is the translated meaning of his birthplace, Xochimilco, which is a Nahuatl or Aztec word written as a glyph. You can see the glyph on the screen in the kind of yellows and greens and blues. It's a glyph which indicates a garden of flowers. But in Urrutia's liberal arts approach, he also knows that it refers to Roger van der Weyden's famous 15th century painting, the Miraflores altarpiece, which resides in Spain, or the 16th century historic flowered seaside area of Lima, Peru. And he knows that Miraflores is a set of locks of the Panama Canal because he was there at its opening in 1914. The word mira also translates as another place, a watchtower, which is an architectural structure of which we know Urrutia was particularly fond. Urrutia's friends often referenced him as a bridge between the arts and the sciences. He was also a bridge between San Antonio communities, from the city's north side, where he lived and built his garden, to downtown San Antonio, where he practiced medicine, and to the west side, where most of his patients lived, and beyond. Urrutia's contributions were known by many. Urrutia was never able to return to Mexico, but his friends, many of them illustrious Mexicans of the time, visited him in San Antonio and consoled him with their letters, poetry, and friendship. Some of their writings marveled about Miraflores, and the press was fascinated by Urrutia's garden and the life he built in San Antonio. And for good reason. In Urrutia's interconnected world, art, architecture, architecture, science, folklore, culture, history, plants, people, places. All disciplines were bound together as one, and Miraflores encompassed all of this in the beauty of a garden unlike any other. Thank you.
He has received multiple awards for his design work, and in 2016, the Texas Society of Landscape Architects recognized him with its Community Service Award. His service to the garden led in 2020 to the American Society of Landscape Architects Council of Fellows elevation. John received his BA in biology with a minor in fine arts from Case Western Reserve University and a master's of landscape architecture from the University of Michigan. So please join me in welcoming John Troy back to the garden.
Thank you. I'd like to thank Katie for her technical expertise to help me. Early this morning I added one slide that I thought would be interesting, and I'll tell you where it is. I'm really impressed with this whole botanical garden. I've been part of it for 30 years, and I wanted to thank you for being here. The Betty Kelso Center and all our facilities took over $40 million over a 20-year period of where we've bought properties and we've advanced the art of connecting people with the world of plants. And Sabina Carr is an incredible CEO, and I wanted to thank her, Katie, her staff, and everyone else for making this day possible. So I have a couple other thank yous. I really have to thank Elise Urrutia for her advice and consultation during this presentation, understanding more about her family and the garden. Dr. Kathryn O'Rourke, of course, is a friend and is very smart about all the aspects of history and the connection of the Mexican culture to the Urrutia garden. And Ann Salisbury, who works with me, was outstanding in texting me all the time with, did you think about this and did you think about that? And so I really appreciate her personal help. And of course, credits for the photos. Please, I've been asked not to take any photos of this because this is a copyrighted presentation. Cultural landscapes can be defined as landscapes that were consciously designed or laid out by a landscape architect, master gardener, architect, or horticulturalist, according to design principles, or by an amateur gardener working in a recognized style or tradition. So today we're talking about a cultural landscape, a garden that was created by somebody that connected to the land. So the human spirit, the land, and their inspiration. So gardens have always been an expression of our values, our culture, and the enduring connection we have to the land. Gardens are portraits of a place in our imagination. And as you can just think about what Elise just spoke about, this incredible, multi-talented Dr. Urrutia had really brought all these thoughts to this garden and his connection to the land. And we're going to talk about it a little bit and how this is a cultural landscape. And I would also like to refer back to the master plan report that was done in 2007 for Miraflores that has a lot of historical data and analysis about the garden, which is just what we're adding to today and bringing new ideas to the table. So Miraflores is an excellent example of this type of cultural landscape. It is private and now public. So until June of 2021, my knowledge of Miraflores was just this. Looking in my rearview mirror if a car was passing me, and looking at these gates. And what did those gates represent? I knew nothing more, I knew nothing less. Kathryn called me and Elise called me and said, would you talk about Miraflores? And I said, I don't know anything about Miraflores. Is the gate that's down at the San Antonio Museum of Art part of what this was? Like, I had no clue, and I'm really being honest about it. I'm a landscape architect. I love San Antonio, and I've been involved with a lot of you all in the room, but I really knew very little about it. So it was a very eye-opening, enlightening opportunity. And we've already heard that his home The Urrutia home is about a mile away from Miraflores. It was a grand home. We have the acreage, what is it, 350 acres of Breckenridge Park next to this, which is a significant public park in the United States. And we have Miraflores next to this, evolving at a similar time, but separated from. We have the San Antonio River, the source of water of our city. We have 12,000 years of history. And we have Broadway, which was the main street coming up from downtown. So we have this rich cultural landscape confluence, so to speak, of all these kind of physical and people, and Dr. Urrutia lands right in the middle of one of the most, of the cultural landscape part of our city. I mean, how wonderful is that? And how much can we appreciate that? So this map really tells us how this part of our city developed and how we're trying to connect with this. So we've already heard a lot about the history, but to briefly summarize it, Miraflores is a design landscape that was once a 15-acre garden, but really it was only a 4.5 acre. It was really 15 acres of land, 4.5 was developed in the garden. Now, it is now being evaluated for use as a public garden for all to appreciate its beauty. Dr. Urrutia, a surgeon by profession, as we know, was a gardener and a landscape artist by avocation. The garden is multi-layered design that evolved and developed from 1921 through 1962. It is a fascinating story of passion and commitment to our community and to the history of Mexico. And after 1962, the property went through a series of owners. We don't need to really go into that. It ultimately ended up as city property in 2006. That same year, Miraflores was placed on the National Register for Historic Places. And in 2007, the City Commission, RVK, with a fabulous team of other people, not all of which I'm mentioning, to evaluate the state of the garden and develop a master plan. We are here today to develop a deeper understanding of that garden's history and landscape design, which will help us define how it should be preserved and used in the future. So what is this about? Its influences on this design of the garden. And we've heard all these pieces, so I'm repeating some of the things, but I think that's important because that pulls a thread together for this conversation today. We have Mexican history, we have the artistic culture of Mexico and San Antonio, and the blending of the two. We have the landscape character of Mexico, and we have European garden design. So Dr. Urrutia was very committed to many aspects of Mexican history, including the Aztecs, which we had pre-Spanish colonizations, and they founded the land in Mexico City, where Mexico City eventually landed, and oh, thank you. And so it really, he loved the history of Mexico, and he tied in the Aztec culture. Somebody was asking, so I grew up back east, and I was talking with Kathryn yesterday, or Ann, and then I shared with Kathryn that I grew up back east, and Ann said, well, we all took history of Mexico and the Southwest in high school. I said, remember, Ann, I grew up back east, and the closest to Mexico I knew was Jamestown. So, you know, back east, they really didn't teach much of the Mexican, Central American culture connecting to the United States. So, although I've been to Mexico City, I think it's significant that Dr. Urrutia grew up there and that he loved the history of Mexico. So as part of that, he helped bring the tradition of Talavera tile, as Elise had mentioned, to San Antonio. These particular details, and you'll see in later pictures, these are actual from the convent at Churubusco in Mexico, and you can see how the influence of this, he brought it directly. It's like, here's A, here's B. It's direct connection with the Virgin of Guadalupe and the historic context of the use of Spanish colonial tiles and that influence. So that was another factor. Another aspect of the artistic culture was Dr. Urrutia was proud of his culture in Mexico, as we've said, and Mexico City is a modern metropolis with a long and rich artistic tradition of Aztec, Spanish colonial, and modern Mexico, all celebrated by the elite, trying to become a unique city of its own, not necessarily European. He wanted to bring that to San Antonio and broaden people's horizons about the sophistication of Mexico culture. So when we talk about Miraflores, we're going to ask ourselves, how can we tell the story of Mexico to people like myself who grew up back east, who don't know a lot about it? I would love to go back to the original garden, or where it was in 1962 perhaps, or perhaps at its very high point, and really learn the history of Mexico. What a great opportunity to learn about our past and our neighbor. And I think it's a rich opportunity for us, and we have to uncover what's possible. And as we already talked about, inspired by his birthplace of Xochimilco, a World Heritage Site near Mexico City for its canals and floating gardens. So he was born in that area. Elise showed you some of the pictures, and I think that's pretty important for him to bring the culture of the landscape, the ponds, and the trees, but especially Chapultepec Park. There are several parks, but Chapultepec Park goes way back to the Aztecs, and the culture of that park through the Spanish colonization and the Mexican leadership in the modern Mexico really developed into promenades, picturesque landscapes, wooded parks, and European-influenced water features. And here you'll see it almost looks like our river walk with the cypress trees going down in LA, and yet they also brought in European traditions of formal fountains that you might have seen at Versailles or other famous European gardens. But Mexico wanted to become Mexico. They wanted an artistic culture that was distinctly theirs. And Dr. Urrutia, it seems, and not knowing him well, like the family does, seemed to really have such a deep passion. Memory is a great thing, and I think that we're all blessed by being able to incorporate our memory into the way we experience our lives. And Dr. Urrutia, being a surgeon, multi-wives, multi-kids, part of the culture of the elite of Mexico, political connections, was a fascinating person and wanted to bring these influences from Mexico. So here is his garden, the sanatorio, which Elise mentioned had a hospital connection to it. While living in Mexico, Dr. Urrutia filled his sanatorio Urrutia with historical and cultural influences to create a sophisticated, professionally designed garden environment. The visitor enjoyed a garden with winding paths, shady groves, tranquil, reflecting ponds, a grotto, and a waterfall, influenced by European. And so we see what Dr. Urrutia already had in Mexico, and it's almost a duplicate here with some new creative twists. He was in his late 40s when he moved here, so he was in a mid-career. He lived to 100, so it was a little early mid-career. His love of Mexico history, but he was mature at that point. He had already done gardens. He had already been involved with Mexican elite culture, social events, and political aspects. So what did he get when he got here? I tried reading some of the I read some of the 2007 report, and it doesn't really describe a lot about the physical nature of the land, but it was heavily wooded, perhaps. It was full of springs prone to flooding, and it's densely wooding. We cannot forget, with this photograph here, showing that it can flood. San Antonio, we know, gets floods, and there's a number of examples of where it's flooded. So he picked a spot that could definitely be challenged by some of the water and some of the other aspects of the land. But most of the history that's been written is who owned the land and when did they buy it and how did he get a hold of it and so forth. But this design is a garden, included the imposing arch entry, winding paths, again like his garden in Mexico. A wooded landscape punctuated by sculpture, ornate Talavera benches, urns, a series of fountains, pools, ponds, and a summer house we've all heard about. It was a personal vision. This landscape was an evolving design, not fixed at a point in time. He was not a trained landscape architect. If I had done it, I probably would have been orthogonal and had all these grids and things. And he really allowed his passion to play into the design. It lacked perfect symmetry. And I think there was a struggle with that in the master plan to say, do we reinvent what he did, or do we allow this poetic and romantic charm of what he had become the design that we want to appreciate? Because not only is there the story of the design, but there is the actual physical presentation of the history of Mexico. This is so complex, and I had 3 months. So here is the 15 acres. On your far upper right here, you can see this was, over here was the entrance from Broadway. But none of this land was developed. This, in 1939, this slide was really the 4.5 acre garden that was appreciated. And so here is the gate that was at Broadway. You already saw these slides. And I always thought, when I went to the art museum, that this gate here at the art museum was over on Hildebrand. And Ann kept saying to me multiple times in the last 3 months, no, John, it was over on Broadway. And Kathryn and Elise also reinforced that. But really, my understanding of what is this cultural landscape was really rather vague and uninformed. And I readily admit to that. So here we have a recent Google Earth picture of what is in decay. I would have to say gardens in our lives, and we all know this from our personal gardens, are always getting better or worse. The gardens never stay the same. The rain comes, we had a snow. So this garden is on the downhill slide, but it's on the uphill slide because the city now owns it, has committed to trying to have conferences like this with Elise's interest in writing a book. And so what are we doing with this garden? What is happening with this space? And how are we going to preserve it is really my part of the presentation today, to ask those questions. And so Elise shared with me this map. So because I'm a landscape architect, I like plan views. And we really started up here at Hildebrand, and then you have this sort of non-symmetrical walk with an esplanade, with the ponds that Elise has shown you, with the photograph of the architects and the statue down here that's no longer extant, and the Centennial Plaza, and then Breckenridge Park off to our left. And this really is part of Breckenridge Park right now, but we have to decide, this was Dr. Urrutia's garden. Is it a park? Is it a garden? What is it, and how is it going to get better? Because we're here today to say, what can we do to make, and it's already, some things are already being done. So again, the gates here, we showed the entrance from Hildebrand, and as I always thought, the other thing was here, but it was always just like this. And of course, the celebration of Hernan Cortez and Dr. Urrutia in the tile display, which we see here. We're now 500 years this year, 1921 was 400, 2021 is 500, and so we have a celebration of the Spanish colonialization and over the Aztecs and all that history. But this garden is in decay. This is a picture taken in June 2021. This is really, if you haven't been there, because the gates are locked and we're like excluded from it, that this really is what you see today. What are we going to do with this? And how are we going to take this rich cultural landscape that tells the story of Mexico and translate that into something for more of the public to appreciate? And we're going to talk about that a little bit more. And here's the esplanade in its condition today with the benches, and some of the Talavera benches are behind me, and sculptures that you walked along and learned about the history of Mexico. And here was the library tower that Elise pointed out that had his private collection of books. I think this was taken maybe in 1940. And so do we recreate something that is the imagination of, or a duplicate of, or nothing? And you have to ask yourselves, what are we going to do with the history of this garden and that sort of intellectual conversation that is so exciting about what's available. And Cuauhtémoc was the last Aztec before the Spanish colonization took over, and so here's his conversation about Aztecs, Spanish colonization, and/or future of Mexico. And the Talavera benches, and bring in those pieces to tell part of the story. And here is a fountain. Elise showed this picture. I'm going to take it another step. but it's like around Mexico City are volcanoes, and the lava and the rock that comes out of the volcanoes is spewing out of the fountain here. It's sort of multi-images. And the water's coming out, it's the grand fountain of the parks of Chapultepec, but it's also an indication of this, you know, what happened around Mexico City and the volcanic activity and the flow of the lava and or the water. And so here's what's left today. And so do we go back and show this, and are we able to show that, or do we show this with a plan view or a QR code and say this is what it was? And part of that has been attempted by this master plan in 2007, but today we're here because we're trying to evaluate it 13 years later, and what did they do well and what did they do not. Did not explain well in that report because we're in a new point in time with new information. So again, here's the garden in its heyday with the architects. Aureliano invites all these architects in 1931 with the ponds, and they're all celebrating, and he wanted this garden for the elite. Remember, it was a private garden. And here is the Centennial Plaza in June 2021, and the statue of Dr. Urrutia is up there. We'll show another. And they're restoring it with original brick. It had flowers, it had plants. You know, what are we going to do with this? Is it just going to be a pretty garden? Like, you know, the garden here is activated for people to use it. Is this going to be activated for people to use it? Okay, so here's an RVK sketch. So there's current efforts that have been done to say, how do we recreate a part of the garden, and the city has dedicated some money to do this. And here you can see the reuse of some of the original brick and creating some of the brick. And this, there's some wonderful words here celebrating the 100th centennial of the American School, and other people can go into all that detail because there is so much detail and knowledge that is over my head about the garden. So here's Dr. Urrutia. Originally the statue faced the other way, but when Breckenridge Park made a connection, because it's now part of Breckenridge Park, they turned the statue around, and there used to be an urn here originally. And so this is sort of an in-between stage. This is the view you might have seen 50, 75 years ago with the slush, and I showed this last because do we go back to this, or do we and say that's where we are now, or do we go to this with a restoration to a full landscape wooded, you know, more intimate kind of presentation? And here is the 1923 summer house, but also shows that they have some flood mitigation aspects. The faux bois, Mexican artists created sculptural works including at least 10 faux bois, imitation wood, and faux stone objects by Dionisio Rodriguez. I'm not fluent in Spanish, you can tell. But he came from Mexico. What I found interesting is Dr. Urrutia brought him from Mexico. That was part of bringing Mexico here. And Patsy Light is here today, has written books on this. But I've had Patsy's book. I haven't read her whole book, but I didn't realize that he came from Mexico. How exciting is that the people that were creating the garden, not just Dr. Urrutia, but were part of this fabric of the garden. And so later on, people added signs. And do we want signs in the garden for the faux bois work, for the saguaro cactus and or the broken tree trunk? These beautiful works of faux bois, and that are also part of the story. But do we want signage like that? That's a question. I'm not showing that to inform you what's on it, but it's like, that doesn't really work for me. I will comment on that. And how are we going to inform people later? So we also took the Nike of Samurais from his house, and he put it in the garden here. And it's sort of this whole mix. This is sort of, you know, you really need to go through. It's just such a, it's almost like a Wagner opera where there's like 14 themes going on at one time. And you have all this Mexican cultural history, all these people who show up here, all the elite of San Antonio, all the doctors, the architects, ateliers. It is such a complex subject that I can't really fully, I don't feel fully, I'm appreciative of being up here, but I can't fully say that I have all that knowledge, but I want to learn more. And I just want to thank all the people that we all took a selfie here, because this is real. We are evaluating the people in the room here, other than Kathryn. She had just left a few minutes before this. But here we are in the garden. What are we doing with the garden? And so it is not my intent to say what the future of this garden will be, but rather to have offered some observations of its history and its current conditions. Ultimately, the city parks will manage this garden for the city by evaluating numerous considerations, collaborating with various stakeholders, along with determining dollars available, will determine priorities and preservation policies. So when you get to the panel, some of the questions I have is how relevant is the 2007 master plan to today? What is the message of the garden to be conveyed to the public? Will the garden be preserved only as a unique piece of history to enlighten us on the history and culture of Mexico? Or will the garden be a repurposed design documenting its past, yet allow for new uses to increase visitorship? If so, how to provide accessibility to the garden, such as parking? We have a complex landscape with great, rich cultural history, and I hope that we all in this room spread that word and bring this garden back to the character and the knowledge for our whole city to understand it as part of our total city landscape. So thank you very much. I hope I didn't take too long.
She is a professor of anthropology and chairs the Department of Sociology and Anthropology at Trinity University. She holds a BA from San Diego State and PhD in anthropology from the University of California, Riverside. She has worked at the Yucatan Peninsula since 1993, studying the ancient, historic, and contemporary Maya. Professor Mathews is the co-editor of Quintana Roo Archaeology, Lifeways in the Northern Maya Lowlands, New Approaches to Archaeology in the Yucatan Peninsula, and The Value of Things, Prehistoric to Contemporary Commodities in the Maya Region. She also published the monographs Chicle, Chewing Gum, Chicle of the Americas, Chicle, Chewing Gum of the Americas, From the Ancient Maya to William Wrigley, and Sugar Cane and Rum, The Bittersweet History of Labor and Life in the Yucatan Peninsula. She was the 2019 recipient of the Dr. Z.T. Scott Faculty Fellowship and of the Piper Professorship in 2020 in recognition of her work as a teacher and mentor at Trinity University. Her talk is A Garden of Goddesses and Emperors, an archaeological perspective of the Miraflores Garden. So please join me in welcoming Jen.
Good morning, and thank you so much for having me here. I want to start today by thanking Kathryn O'Rourke and Elise Urrutia for organizing today's session. Kathryn started this morning by saying, what is your Miraflores story? And so mine started maybe about 5 years ago, in which I attended a lecture by Kathryn O'Rourke talking about the Miraflores Garden. And I went running up to her immediately after and said, I need to know more. And this turned into a series of conversations with Elise and a number of lovely lunches around town, envisioning this very program today. And so I want to thank both of you for all of the work that you put into making this a reality and for including me. And I also want to congratulate Elise on her marvelous upcoming book, and I can't wait to get a hold of it. And lastly, I want to thank Elise for sharing her photos and her research with me, which were essential in putting together today's presentation. Like many of you, for years I was struck by curiosity as I walked or drove past the garden along the gates of Hildebrand Avenue. And further, as an archaeologist, I was immediately struck by the sculptures and imagery that had been plucked from archaeological contexts in places like Greece and Mexico to create this new narrative in this sanctuary of Dr. Urrutia's, known as the Miraflores Garden. As both Kathryn and Elise have remarked in their talks today and in previous writings, this mix of European and Mexican art on his garden landscape was a way to highlight the cultures and landscapes that were significant to his own life. To me, the garden is a kind of outdoor museum, and one that reflected his role as a citizen of Mexico, but living in San Antonio in the early 20th century. So today I'm going to take a look at 3 sculptures specifically, Winged Victory, Cuauhtemoc, and the Coyolxauhqui sculpture. I'm first going to provide a little bit of background about the archaeological discoveries and interpretations of their original context, and then I'll provide a little bit of background about their location in the garden and perhaps some significance that they may have held for Dr. Urrutia. So let me begin with a discussion of the copy of the Hellenistic marble sculpture of Winged Victory, or the Nike of Samothrace. And of course, I want to state up front that I am a Maya archaeologist. This is not my expertise. I did consult with experts, so I want to thank Dr. Nicole Hirschfeld for her help with that, but any mistakes are my own. In ancient Greek mythology, Nike was the goddess of victory. The inspiration for Dr. Urrutia's sculpture was originally located within the sanctuary of Samothrace on the island of Samothrace off the coast of northeastern Greece. The sanctuary, which was continuously modified during its occupation, was dedicated to great gods, and pilgrims from all over came to be at the sanctuary. The original location for the sculpture was placed so that the sight line from the marble sculpture, which stood over 18 foot tall, would be seen throughout the heart of the sanctuary. So it was a very centering device within this original sanctuary. The white marble statue stood atop of a ship's prow, made of blue-gray marble that comes from the Isle of Rhodes. There is a general scholarly agreement, although there's not much agreement ever in academia, but there is general agreement that this was a dedicated monument for a naval victory, probably around the 2nd century BCE. And this would have been erected by the victors, of course, as a public statement of their triumph, but also as a thanking of the gods for their help in winning the battle. There is, however, still considerable debate about who commissioned the sculpture, who the artist was, and the specific naval victory this represents, although there has been some recent scholarship that argues that it was commissioned by the Isle of Rhodes, who was the source of the blue-gray marble. In 1863, in April, working with local laborers, a French diplomat and amateur archaeologist discovered marble sections of a woman's torso, legs, and several smaller fragments of what appeared to be feathers as part of the wings. In 1879, the archaeologist loaded the pieces onto a ship and delivered them to France, where they were then painstakingly reassembled. When she was put back together, scholars could see that the figure wore a tunic of fine cloth that was gathered with a belt, as well as a cloak that wraps around her lower body. Although the head, parts of the wings, arms, and feet are broken or missing, what archaeologists like to do is to look to comparative examples to see if we can reconstruct it. And there are several small terracotta statues from Turkey that give us a sense of what the original may have looked like. Once put back together, the scholars modeled a plaster replica of the sculpture, but it did not have the wings. And they placed it on top of the original base, and they found this so impressive, this 18-foot tall replica, that they decided that they had to add the wings back in. In 1844, the sculpture was placed atop a monumental staircase at the Louvre Museum of Paris, where it has been viewed literally by millions of people since. In San Antonio, a copy of Winged Victory stood atop the home of Dr. Urrutia, known as the Quinta Urrutia. The statue faced south towards his original home in Mexico City, where her doppelganger, the Angel of Independence, has resided since 1910. The angel statue was commissioned by Porfirio Diaz in honor of Mexico's centennial celebration. As Elise notes in her book, Dr. Urrutia would have been very familiar with this monument, as well as with the copy of the sculpture that was at the Academy of San Carlos, which was very near to his medical practice. He also likely saw the original when he traveled to Paris. She further notes that friends of his were well aware of what the sculpture meant to him, and on the occasion of his 48th birthday, his friend Nemesio Garcia Naranjo said he viewed the Winged Victory sculpture as, quote, a beautiful symbol chosen to protect his home, which presides over his entire existence, his soul, always tied to the mast of duty and work. It carries forward his ship with its invincible beating of wings, end quote. In the years before the Quinta Urrutia home was demolished, Dr. Urrutia moved the statue to its current location, overlooking Hildebrand Avenue. Like her placement at Samothrace, I believe that he used this as a kind of sight line into the garden, a kind of centering in the heart of the garden. And I wonder if also it isn't also leading him towards his church across the street at Incarnate Word, which I know was very important to him. And so I think that perhaps as one of the final additions to the Miraflores garden being moved very late, that perhaps Winged Victory helped him to keep those memories of home alive in his adopted home of San Antonio. Next, I'd like to discuss the 1921 statue depicting the Aztec or Mexica Emperor Cuauhtemoc. Crouching on a pedestal with his fist to the sky, this sculpture marks the middle of the Miraflores garden. Emperor Cuauhtemoc was only 25 years old when he took power of Tenochtitlan in 1520. The capital city had suffered a massacre by Spanish conquerors, killing his cousin Montezuma II in the process. Although Montezuma's brother, Cuitlahuac, had assumed rulership, he died almost immediately because smallpox was ravaging the city. Cuauhtemoc was then elected the ruler, but in August of 1521 was captured by Hernan Cortez while fleeing the city with his family. Reportedly, Cuauhtemoc was said to ask Cortez to take his knife from him and strike him dead. Cortez is said to have respected his bravery and released him temporarily. However, upon not finding any gold, Cortez recaptured Cuauhtemoc and tortured him to learn of its location. Cuauhtemoc demonstrated great resistance according to folks that were there at the time, and ultimately he was once again released, although temporarily. 4 years later, Cortez ended up executing him out of fear that he was leading an assassination attempt against him. And since his death, Cuauhtemoc has stood as a symbol of indigenous resilience and resistance in Mexico. In Mexico City, the 1887 monument to Cuauhtemoc was dedicated to the last Mexica ruler of the capital of Tenochtitlan. Created by sculptor Miguel Norena and engineer Francisco Jimenez, it was created to promote indigenous imagery during the Porfirio Diaz regime. At the time, it was seen as a bold representation of an indigenous figure, but as we can see, he is draped like a Greek, right? And it is the very embodiment of a colonial representation of indigeneity. Interestingly, the original sculpture shares a prominent location with Winged Victory along the Avenida Reforma in Mexico, and according to Google Maps, if you walked it would be about a 15-minute walk. And clearly Dr. Urrutia would have been very familiar with it. However, according to Elise, her grandfather wanted to create a different representation of Cuauhtemoc that would serve as the very first statue in the garden at Miraflores. Dr. Urrutia was proud of his indigenous heritage and wanted to emphasize the notion of cultural survival. He hired a young Mexican artist by the name of Luis Sanchez, who had experience in Monterrey creating cemetery sculpture. Dr. Urrutia provided Sanchez with a photograph of the sculpture that he had seen in the courtyard of the San Carlos Academy in Mexico City, again, the art school very close to his medical practice. Urrutia preferred this image of the emperor. He wore a more simple feather headdress, a loincloth, and sandals while looking to the heavens. And he felt that this defiant pose better reflected the strength of the young man who had resisted Hernan Cortez. However, the photo he provided to Sanchez lacked many of the details that were needed to create the replica, and Elise indicates that Dr. Urrutia actually partnered with the artist to provide him with his understanding of human anatomy. And you can see in these wonderful pictures that Elise took in 1977 just how much detail of anatomy is there. The figure is almost trembling. It looks so tense in this beautiful pose. Elise further recounts that when the sculpture was unveiled in 1921, there was an exiled Mexican journalist who was working at La Prensa, which some of you may know was the first Spanish newspaper in San Antonio. And he said that the statue captured the outrage of indigenous peoples. Quote, "The entire statue, from the highest feathers of the plume to the clenched toes, cries of injustice, one of the major injustices in the histories of humanity. Just remember the opulent constructions of Palenque, of Chichen Itza, of Mitla, and of Teotihuacan, to comprehend that something grand and divine was destroyed. And even though the colonial monuments proclaim the glory of one superior civilization, never will they constitute a convincing argument for the tragic sacrifice of a race. For this marble Indian protests, his clenched fist is that of Cuauhtemoc rebuking the gods and threatening the sky," end quote. And I would say that despite the wear and tear that this sculpture has seen, you can still feel this power emanating from his defiant fist and clenched toes. Lastly, I will turn to the statue of Coyolxauhqui, which is tucked into a corner of the Miraflores garden adjacent to Cuauhtemoc and along the pool that Dr. Urrutia called the Bath of Nezahualcóyotl, who was named for another Aztec emperor. In Mexica or Aztec mythology, the legend of Coyolxauhqui describes a young goddess who plotted with her brothers to kill their mother, Coatlicue, or she of the serpent's scourge. They were outraged because they had found out that she was pregnant, not by a man, but in fact was impregnated by a floating ball of feathers, because you have to love mythology, right? Warned of their plot, the brother and god Huitzilopochtli, or the hummingbird on the left, oops, shown right here, he emerges from his mother's body, coming out as a warrior with weapons, and in fact strikes his sister Coyolxauhqui down, and he does so at the summit of Coatepec meaning Serpent Mountain, and he beheads her, and her body is thrown down to the bottom of the mountain, and he tosses her head into the sky, and she becomes the moon. The Miraflores sculpture is based on a large greenstone head that has been known since the 19th century. It was found at the Templo Mayor at Tenochtitlan, the Aztec capital, and it is a greenstone officially identified as diorite. Greenstones like jade and diorite were precious for ancient Mesoamericans, such as the Aztec and the Maya. They were seen as living, breathing stones. The sculpture is of a decapitated head, and you can see that her eyes are partially closed, indicating her lifeless state. And the cheeks are decorated with bells attached with little symbols for gold on them. The back of the head has striated hair covered with a radial feather ornament and down balls, which were symbols of sacrifice. And the nose ornament on the front is of a crescent shape and is often used as an identifier of Aztec goddesses. So we see this as a repeating image on the Aztec goddesses. Now, Dr. Urrutia would have recognized this goddess as one of the premier indigenous images of Mexico. Although once placed on a simple pedestal at his home, the sculpture was ultimately moved to Miraflores, where it sat upon a simplified body of a Coatlicue statue, the mother that she was going to kill, which I think is a very kind of interesting and complex idea that he might have been presenting here. However, rather than the usual serpent clothing of Coatlicue that you see here, the statue appears to be feathered, and so it may also be a conflation of perhaps Quetzalcoatl, another famous Aztec god, a feathered serpent. In Miraflores, the location of the goddess Coyolxauhqui near the emperor Cuauhtemoc, along the bath of another Aztec emperor, creates a powerful triad of indigenous identity in a garden mixed with European symbolism. And I would think of this sector as a kind of origin story of his indigenous identity. And in many ways, the garden overall is symbolic of Dr. Urrutia himself, a mestizo man who was very proud of his complicated identity and living in his adopted city. So like the pilgrims who once visited Winged Victory in Samothrace, I hope that one day soon, San Antonians will be able to walk the grounds of Miraflores Garden among the goddesses and emperors that reflect this refuge of Dr. Urrutia. Thank you so much.
Our final speaker of this portion of the program, I'm sure is familiar to many of you. Phillip Santos is a writer, journalist, and documentary filmmaker. His two memoirs, Places Left Unfinished at the Time of Creation, which was a National Book Award finalist, and The Farthest Home, Is It an Empire of Fire, together tell the ancestral stories of his mother and father's families. It is an American origin story of the centuries-long migrations that emerged out of Spain, Mexico, and the lands that became South Texas. His book of poems is Songs Older Than Any Known Singer. An Emmy-nominated television producer, Santos has produced more than 40 broadcast documentaries and news programs on cultural themes in 16 countries for CBS and PBS. His journalism and commentary has appeared in publications including the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, the San Antonio Express News, the Manchester Guardian, and Texas Monthly. During his 6 years as a program officer at the Ford Foundation, Santos directed the philanthropic program in media, infrastructure, and production, overseeing more than $40 million in grants to independent media networks in the US, Latin America, Africa, and Asia. A proud graduate of Texas Public Schools, Santos was the first Latino to be selected as a Rhodes Scholar and holds degrees in English Literature and Language from Oxford University and in Philosophy and Literature from the University of Notre Dame. He lives in his hometown of San Antonio with his wife, poet Frances Trevino Santos, and their daughter Francesca de la Luz. Since 2010, Santos has been University Distinguished Scholar in Mestizo Cultural Studies, teaching in the Honors College at the University of Texas, San Antonio. In 2017, he was awarded the Texas Medal for the Arts in Literature. His talk today is In the Ruins of Miraflores, Conjuring Don Aureliano's Forgotten Garden of Future Remembrances. Please join me in welcoming Phillip.
Thanks so much, Kathryn, and thanks to Elise for the invitation to join this extraordinary group of folks this morning and talking about Miraflores. Last night I rebooted my title and didn't do a new title slide, so I'll just give you the new title. It is Reading the Ruins of Dr. Urrutia's Timeless Garden of Future Remembrance. I first came to focusing directly on the gardens. Oh, I didn't put it in there. It didn't show up on my map. I first came to this regard of Miraflores when I was working on a project during the San Antonio tricentennial year. A little chapbook of stories about 12 places, lugares perdidos, lost places of San Antonio, and one of them was the Quinta Urrutia and Miraflores. And it was in that time that I came to regard Dr. Urrutia as the nexus of this extraordinary outpouring of creativity, of science, of cultural remembrance. And I had grown up knowing the gardens. My mom taught in the 1970s, my mom taught at the University of the Incarnate Word. My brothers and I would often sneak into those gardens. They were still fenced up, and we would find the Banca de Hernán Cortés and sit where the Conquistador sat. We saw the Cuauhtémoc statue. We wondered how all of this fit into the story of San Antonio. We weren't taught then that this was, in fact, the story of San Antonio, that this was, in a sense, a living ruin of America's other origin story. The origin story that had transpired 100 years before Plymouth Rock. The origin story that came to bring about the founding of San Antonio. So it was a kind of an inadvertent awakening of sorts, part of that gathering palimpsest, a palimpsest of wonders that Miraflores is, a kind of a pleasure palace, a codex, a dream book of sorts. And in this period when I was working on the Lugares Perdidos material, I came to know this book, the Pinacoteca. There's a copy of it in the UTSA Special Collections, part of the legacy of Elise's family. I think it was maybe a gift book to the doctor on the occasion of his 48th or 49th birthday. The copy, just a little sidebar, the copy in the Special Collections was from the library of Don Felix Almaraz, one of the most impressive ex libris stickers I've ever seen in a book. Here, an original José Cisneros ex libris sticker. So this book is an extraordinary gathering of photographs of the Quinta Urrutia, one which captures some of that splendor of Dr. Urrutia's imagination, the courtyard that can conjure memories of Sevilla, the extraordinary comedor, I didn't include today representations of the extraordinary art that was part of the household collection. But just here on the this side here, let's see, is this? Oh, nope. You can see here. Let's see if there's. This is a Cuauhtemoc tile with some kind of more of a fleur-de-lis. I designed this tile on the left. So the Pinacoteca gave me a glimpse into the extraordinary object world of the doctors. And the sense that this was a very different part of the ambiente of being Mexican in San Antonio. Not a kind of mexicanidad that many of us experienced, but one that was part of the great story of our Chicano story in San Antonio. And important to bring it into the heart of our experience and our memory, and to understand that Dr. Urrutia's imagination, his intuition, was in fact a kind of longing for a way of connecting San Antonio to this great epic of Mexico, the great story from which we emerged. A mestizo narrative. Martín Cortés, the offspring of Marincin and Hernán Cortés. We talked about Sor Juana, also mestiza. José Vasconcelos, almost a Tejano from Piedras Negras, who authors the Raza Cósmica and begins to imagine the idea of a mestizo mind, a vernacular, an American vernacular of a kind of a cosmic race, a race of all races. So part of the magic of Dr. Urrutia's imagination was the way that he evoked in his work, in his household, in the garden itself, this extraordinary presence of mestizo mind. And in the context of a garden, as we've heard, Dr. Urrutia was born in Xochimilco in 1872, and when he creates his first clinic in Coyoacán, he evokes a garden there. So he's born in a garden, he creates his first clinic and imagines a garden into being at his first clinic. So this is a mestizo mind with a garden obsession. I think we can say it safely. And I think it's important to understand that, talking to Elise, apparently there are no original designs in Miraflores. There are no records. It was, in a sense, almost intuited into being. And that is an extraordinary testimonio to the way that this mestizo vernacular imagination works. That, it's not necessarily a scripted legacy. It's something that is intuitive, improvised, as our beloved Tomás Ybarra-Frausto calls it, an outpouring of rascuachismo, a certain kind of improvisational intuition. But drawing from this deep well of sources in the indigenous world, in the European world, Iberian and beyond. So the place of the garden, and we've seen some of these images before, I'll slightly tune differently in terms of my evocation of them. When I see these images of the splendor of the waters, when I see the splendor of the pools that made up the landscape of the garden, In the Mexican imagination, in the mestizo remembrance, water is very closely connected to divine sources, to the world of Tlalocan, the underworld that is a watery place. And in fact, in the mythologies of origin of the Aztecs and the Chichimecas, their original homeland, whether Chicomostoc or Aztlan, is always represented as a watery place. Water surrounding gardens and splendors of the natural world. This way of thinking about the garden at Miraflores and beyond is something that runs through literary culture. Jorge Luis Borges' extraordinary story, The Garden of Forking Paths, where he writes, century follows century, yet events occur only in the present. Countless men in the air, on the land and sea, yet everything that truly happens to me. So at the nucleus of the Miraflores legacy is the presence of Dr. Urrutia's imagination. This mixture of history and capricho and locuras, inspiration, a reminder of where we came from, but also a reminder that underlying history always are these mythic currents, that we are engaged with epic forces in the way that we have come about in historical time. So Dr. Urrutia's watery place is also an evocation of these origins, but he is historical in his references in parts of the garden. As was pointed out earlier, these two tile murals on the entranceway, where he is next to Hernán Cortés, 1521, Aureliano Urrutia, 1921. 2021 is the 500th anniversary of the fall of the Aztec Empire. You can say, well, that's an audacious act to put yourself alongside this historical figure of Cortés. Well, in fact, we are all alongside that history. We are all part of that scripted pageant. So he was, in a sense, situating the imagination that he was working from out of that deep legacy. And in fact, indeed goes well beyond into indigenous sources, thousands of years preceding his presence here in San Antonio. But how to evoke it with the appearance of deployment of Talavera tile, as John referred to, kind of an inaugural presence of Talavera tile in San Antonio. It existed, but San Antonio was always a very poor place that couldn't afford such luxuries. This is the beginning of a kind of a Mexican embourgeoisement that facilitates an application of some of these traditions here. The banca de Hernán Cortés that we used to sneak in to sit upon, another one of the bancas there, and the way they look today. So again here, with the banca de Hernán Cortés, on the other side is the Dr. Urrutia. So he was literally coeval with the presence of the legacy of the conquest. And then throughout the ruins of the garden as we live them today, and that's really the focus of these remarks, is how do we regard the living presence of the ruins today? And what do they say to us? The proliferation throughout the garden of these talavera plates and tiles, some of which are in fairly decent shape, others are deliberately used almost as a kind of a mosaic, broken talavera. So that which has been broken can still be brought into some framework of new imagination. And throughout also some of the remaining original fixtures, the light stands and the lanterns that have that sort of hint of the Mexican churrigueresque, the great Mexican Baroque art tradition. Churrigueresco is the Mexican Baroque, which is, you take European Baroque and you turn it up to 12. That is the churrigueresco Baroque. Dionisio Rodriguez's faux bois has a number of different appearances in the remains of the garden, and they can stand somewhat ineffably, solitary and without context. An extraordinary pedestal, an empty pedestal where once stood an effigy of Porfirio Diaz. We don't know where Porfirio Diaz disappeared to, whether he was appropriated by sympathizers or hostiles. But today we just have the empty pedestal. Another part of the Dionisio Rodriguez legacy in Miraflores, and this one's particularly evocative because it's the stairway to the missing tower. So it's the stairway not to heaven but to the absence of the tower. Or as was described to me, the tower also had a kind of a library function to it. Another element is the cherubic setting that's a dedication to Dr. Urrutia's daughter, Ana Maria, in 1925. Mingled with faux bois, mingled with Aztec statuary, mingled with effigies to Cuauhtémoc. Not asynchronous, not clamorous, but perfectly natural to Dr. Urrutia's boundless imagination here. So here, the state of one of the bancas in the current Miraflores, getting to this aspect of what has come to our time as various kinds of comminglings of the fleur-de-lis, of a griffin, but this is the state of some of the monuments in Miraflores. They're in a ruinous form, but there's something revelatory about their ruinous state. Again, that which is broken can be adored. That which is broken can speak. Here is a little pedestal that has an example of this assemblage of clay pots that have been filled with cement. And the proliferation of cement at Miraflores may have something to do with the fact that it was within a mile or two of Cementville. So there was a boundless, undoubtedly a boundless supply of cement to be used, including the cast cement sculptures of Cuauhtémoc and Winged Victory. So again, just a few more images of these cracked, these beautifully poetic cracked pedestals. Subjects for restoration or exhibit as they are. The Banca de Hernán Cortés in its current state. A few more of the images. I'm struck by how the iconography on some of the plates will include these little house settings, a mythical bird or a griffin. Again, the use of cracked calavera as a mosaic form for some of the bancas that are in a little more ruined state. But this idea of the bricolage of the broken. A monument to 1716, aquí se celebró la primera misa. An entirely mythological monument, at least by historians' account, that the first Mass wasn't in 1716, it was maybe 1718, and it was a few miles away from here. But imagining this into being, imagining that this was this originary place, the place of waters, the place of origins. Jennifer brilliantly gave us an overview of the Cuauhtémoc sculpture. And again, I'm really interested in how the park has emerged into our time as a palimpsest of decades and of a full century, a century on from the flood of 1921. Elise was saying that maybe the park's original opening was delayed because of the flood of 1921. So a couple of great things about this statue as it exists today. One is that Cuauhtémoc is spelled with an H here. And there was recently a television interview with the grandson of Luis Sanchez, or the great-grandson, I'm not sure his great-grandson or grandson. He was saying, yeah, look, my grandfather, he ran out of room for the H. So that's why the H doesn't appear. But a moment ago you saw an image of this sculpture in John's talk. And it was from Elise's 1970s photograph of the sculpture. And if you look closely at that photograph, you'll see that this inscription didn't exist at that time. Águila que cae, the eagle that falls, which is what Cuauhtémoc means, eagle that falls. When you saw the little glyphic version of Cuauhtémoc, you saw a little falling eagle by his representation. So this is a graffito. Somebody engraved into this stone, Águila que cae, eagle that falls. And even more remarkably, on the side of the sculpture, there's the signature from Luis Sanchez. We had the detail of the Águila que cae. This is on the other side. And look how elaborate this engraving is. And again, this was not there in 1977, when Elise took those photographs. En los relojes del mundo nunca suena la hora de la justicia. In the clocks of the world, the hour of justice never chimes. On a pedestal dedicated to Cuauhtémoc. So it tells you something about the way that the people have come to own this park. Somebody went in there and, I would think, over some time engraved this graffito. Something you can spray on in one night. You know, it's like that's a serious graffito undertaking right there. You know, so these wonders of the park, really we can only understand them through the way that we can evoke Dr. Urrutia's evanescent imagination and what might have brought him to make this park such a profound testimonio to his origins. You know, there's another great garden in American literature in Nathaniel Hawthorne's 1844 story, Rappaccini's Daughter, set in Padua. And in that story, there is a remarkable garden, a garden that is created by a doctor, Dr. Rappaccini. And he's a cultivator of poisonous plants, plants that he creates to make tinctures to heal people. So sort of a kind of homeopathic doctor. The ruins of a marble fountain in the center, sculptured with rare art, so woefully shattered that it was impossible to trace the original design from the chaos of the remaining fragments. Very familiar evocation. Dr. Urrutia's presence today at the garden's fountain. In this fountain, you saw earlier the evocation in the statuary, the inscription alongside the fountain to Father Pedro de Gante, the founder of the first school of Texcoco in 1530, a school that would be instrumental in shaping the Colegio de Santa Cruz in Tlatelolco, where Sahagún would undertake the oral history of the indigenous Nahua world. De Gante is also notorious for baptizing thousands of indigenous people in his saliva. So why he curated these particular figures, these particular biographies and citations in his intuited garden. Jennifer gave us a great brief on the Coatlicue, on the Coyolxauhqui head, augmented on the body of her mother, Coatlicue, the great serpent-skirted goddess. She was so incredibly feared that, when she was, this is the back of the sculpture as we see it today in Miraflores. Let me just go through this one more time here. So the head, the dismembered head of the daughter, Coyolxauhqui, on the body of the mother, of the gods, the mother of the principal god of the Aztecs, Huitzilopochtli, who was so feared, is the greenstone head that Jennifer referred to. She was so feared that when she was dug up, she was discovered in the late 18th century, and she was brought into the plaza, the Zócalo there, and people began bringing her offerings. And the Spaniards realized that she was still very powerful, so they reburied her. So a few years later, when Alexander von Humboldt, the great explorer Alexander von Humboldt, came to Mexico City, he had read of her discovery. He asked that she be exhumed so that he could make drawings of her, which she did. We have his drawings today. Same thing happened. Offerings were brought to her. She was buried again. And she was buried until the 20th century. She remained buried. Today she lives in the Museo Antropológico. She was moved there in 68 in Chapultepec Park, where Cuauhtémoc surrendered the Aztec Empire. So a lot of auspicious confluences here. Coyolxauhqui is very important in terms of this story because Coyolxauhqui, the discovery of this basalt disc of homage to Coyolxauhqui in her dismembered state after the attack by her brother, this discovery of this disc in 1978 led to the rediscovery of the Templo Mayor in Mexico City. So Coyolxauhqui has been the stewardess of a return of memory to Mexico City, and the last 15 years have been a kind of golden age in Mexican anthropology at the Templo Mayor, at Teotihuacan, and other parts of the country. But the dismembered goddess, the dismembered Coyolxauhqui, is the figure that Dr. Urrutia brought to the garden, or it was in his house originally. Ultimately, and we don't know how her head ends up on Coatlicue's body. We don't have that story. It's an amazing idea. And Coyolxauhqui, by the way, in the 1920s was having a bit of a moment in San Antonio because she also is featured in the iconography at the Aztec Theater, which was inaugurated in 1926. Her head, the image of her head, appears over the exit sign. So the next time you're at the Aztec Theater, Coyolxauhqui's big splash in San Antonio. So the goddess who has brought memory back to our time is the great celebrated figure in Miraflores. And here's one of the astounding things, maybe the most mind-blowing thing that I encountered on our visit to Miraflores this summer. Someone made an ofrenda of a nickel inside the sculpture. So I told you that, Coatlicue was brought ofrendas in Mexico City when her effigy appeared. Someone made an ofrenda to the Rascuache Coatlicue Coyolxauhqui assemblage in Miraflores. Just astounding. And then here we are with the, and I'll close here with the Victory of Samothrace, which Jennifer also gave us a description of. In the context of what I've shared with you in terms of the iconography of the living place of Miraflores today, I mean, what do you see that's common with Coyolxauhqui? A dismembered goddess. The garden of the dismembered goddess who brings memory to life. I don't know if that was Dr. Urrutia's intuition about all of these elements. The Victory at Samothrace used to be places you saw over the entrance to the Quinta Urrutia, and the stairway here was the entrance to the Quinta. But we can't discount anything in this story. Sir Thomas Browne, the great essayist of the 17th century in England, has a great garden essay called The Garden of Cyrus. And he placed the garden basically as a symbol of our origins, that the garden in the creation story in Christian tradition was created on the third day, humans 3 days later. So the gardens were already here. The garden preceded the gardener, as Sir Thomas Browne said. So you can't discount any of these connections, these intuitive leaps that the doctor might have made in assembling all of these diverse elements, these elements that conjure the deep past. The second most remarkable thing that happened on our visit this summer was that this hawk appeared. And I don't know if John has seen it, the picture that you took of the fountain has the hawk flying in it. If you go back and look, the hawk is in flight. So not quite an águila, not quite the eagle that fell, but something, our version in San Antonio, we don't have a lot of eagles here. So maybe, the fact that the hawk was sitting in sentry on us while we were making our visit was profoundly moving for me. So I thought I would just end quickly with, as I shared with you, this began with the story of Miraflores, the little piece that, this was the painting that accompanied the chapbook piece that the city commissioned, and by Ana Fernandez. Miraflores, as Don Aureliano Urrutia christened his sprawling estate, looked as if it had been there since the beginning of time, even though it dated only to 1921. Nestled alongside Brackenridge Park and over a grand arched entrance from Broadway, you entered a long garden driveway to arrive at La Quinta Urrutia, casota hewn of limestone and marble that glowed in the daylight as if it had been cut from a sacred quarry where the stone had been set in the amber rays of an earlier sun. Don Aureliano, who'd fled Mexico in the tumult of la Revolucion, created his palace as an homage to the grand mundo mexicano he had sadly left behind. There were Moorish arches in every direction. You looked from the beginning, shimmering entrance hall, built around a patio with a gurgling fountain that echoed the cascading waters of a cistern of its original in the courtyard of the Casa de Califa, in the oldest precinct of age-old Córdoba in Madre España. The extensive jardines were said to be recreated based on the legends and the gardens of the poet cacique Netzahualcoyotl, and if you wandered there long enough, you would encounter a stone bust of the goddess Xochitl, then a storied bench from the palace of Conquistador Cortez himself. A great tile mural in the courtyard was dated 1701, depicting a woman in perpetual devotions before a decorated stone cross, perhaps praying that time might spare all these wonders. Every object in Don Aureliano's world was touched with the grandness of unconfirmed legend, sending many historians into a vertiginous tilt, but bestowing everything you looked upon with an aura of unceasing wonder. Dr. Urrutia's story contained the epics of Mexico and San Antonio alike. A stone marker on the ground celebrated the spot where the first Mass was offered in 1716. Though the historical record is that the event took place miles away in 1718. An altarpiece said to have been painted by Rubens adorned the family salon near a tile portrait of the last cacique of the Mexica, Cuauhtémoc. In one teak cabinet, there was a storied tea set given to Porfirio Diaz by the Emperor of Japan. And the great chandeliers in the same room were proudly described as having once hung in the palace of Emperor Maximiliano and his wife Carlota in Mexico City. The light they cast shone down upon the two great Ming vases that were believed to have been given to Maximiliano by Napoleon III. Between them, there was a small case containing the coins that were described as having been in Maximiliano's pocket on the day he was executed. It is also said that the skies turned crimson the day La Quinta Urrutia was demolished. And for many days that followed, the people walked in a mournful spirit over the mounds of multicolored Talavera tile shards. Thanks very much, y'all. Thank you.
To my right is Donna Guerra, Donna Guerra has practiced as a professional archivist for 22 years at Harvard University, the City of San Antonio, and Trinity University. She is currently the Director of Archives at the Sisters of Charity of the Incarnate Word Archives. She participates in grassroots projects with the Esperanza Peace and Justice Center in the areas of archives, the Museo del West Side, and the West Side Preservation Alliance. So please welcome Donna. And I will also go ahead and introduce our other two panelists as well. Lynn Osborne Bobbitt. Lynn, since 2015, has been the Executive Director of the Brackenridge Park Conservancy, a 501c3 organization. In that role, she oversees the Conservancy's mission to be a steward and advocate for Brackenridge Park. Bobbitt has worked for more than 30 years in the nonprofit San Antonio community as a fundraiser and event producer and grant writer. She has served as the Director of Advancement at St. Luke's Episcopal School, Vice President of Riverwalk Jazz, band leader Jim Cullen's nationally syndicated broadcast series, and is President of the San Antonio Conservation Society. Also is Project Director for the National Public Radio affiliate KTSX 89.1 FM, which preceded Texas Public Radio, and as a historian at the Texas Parks and Wildlife Department. She is a native San Antonian and graduate of the University of Texas at Austin. And Bill Pennell, thank you, yes, welcome Lynn. And Bill Pennell, to my left on the other side of Elise, is the Assistant Manager of Parks Design of the City of San Antonio Parks and Recreation Department. He is a registered landscape architect and received his degree from Texas A&M University. He has more than 20 years of experience in landscape design, park design, construction management, and project management while working in different roles in the private sector and with the city. His projects have included small and large park design, trails and linear parks, historical features and structures, and master planning. Shortly after the city acquired Miraflores, Bill was assigned to manage the development of the 2007 master plan, and since then has been involved with all Miraflores projects. So very special welcome to Bill. Thank you for being here. Thank you all. So I want to start with Donna and ask you a bit about what you have learned as an archivist about Miraflores and what the archives can tell us about where we might go.
Thank you, and good morning, everyone. First, I want to express my gratitude for the book, and congratulations to Elise for this much-needed book on Miraflores, and that I'm also pleased to have met you on your research journey. We've had many interesting and enjoyable conversations, and I look forward to more. So I had to write my notes out because I'm a terrible extemporaneous speaker, But in response to the question, and I have written a kind of concise biography of Dr. Urrutia Sr., but I think we've already heard it. One thing I might add that alongside the things that have been said about in his brief biography as presented here is that he, when he came to San Antonio, he started his own private practice, but he also very soon thereafter his arrival became staff on the Santa Rosa Hospital as a surgeon, and eventually also serving as chief of surgery. So he was everywhere in certainly Miraflores, but also everywhere in what we call Barrio Laredito, and that is the neighborhood that begins west of San Pedro Creek, which is a whole other story that I hope will be told as we learn more and more about Dr. Urrutia Sr. So I am currently the Director of Archives at the Sisters of Charity of the Incarnate Word Congregational Archives. People often tell me, oh, you're at the UIW Archives, and no, in fact, I'm not. We do have UIW records because the sisters opened that, but we have lots of other records from the beginnings of 1869 when the sisters arrived in San Antonio, and their first ministry was in fact Santa Rosa Hospital. It's been on the same city block that it is currently on now as Christus Santa Rosa Children's Hospital since the 1880s. So they've been firmly entrenched in that barrio, we can say. And so, in our archives, we don't really have much about Miraflores per se, but we have evidence about that really reveals a lengthy relationship to the surgeon who built Miraflores. And so that's where our particular archives has its strength. In fact, one of the photos that Elise showed in her presentation of Dr. Urrutia Sr. in his surgical garb, he's looking very tall and clean and ready for work. That is a very unique photograph that came from our archives that was part of a 1915 student scrapbook. And so it was a real joy to discover it and to be able to share that with Elise. I think I remember you saying that it was very emotional for you because it was one of the first photographs you saw of him where he had a little bit of a smile, right? Just the suggestion of a smile. So it has become a very important photograph for her and for our archives. He also, so the reason he's in a student scrapbook is because at the Santa Rosa School of Training Nurses, students would sit in with him or watch his surgeries, and I think he would also have specific classes for them in surgical procedure. So underneath that photograph in the scrapbook is, in quotation marks, chief, right? So because he was the chief of surgery. But it comes through that he was very seriously and well regarded by the students as well, and I'm sensing that there was a sense of humor going on there too. As far as Miraflores directly related records, a UIW librarian dug up a couple of newsletters for me where that relate to the brief time that UIW owned the 4.5 acres of Miraflores, and that was between the year 2000 and 2006. So and so that's not much, and I'm hoping that we'll discover more. All of this research is very ongoing, and so and within this newsletter, it calls the Miraflores Park Alumni Park. So I think that was briefly renamed that, and the event that is described in this newsletter was a Cinco de Mayo celebration day, a fundraiser for some scholarships. And there was from 11 a.m. to 11 p.m. There were high school mariachi bands, and the final band was a rock band called the X Factor. So those of you who are older and might remember this band, I don't. I mean, I'm older, but I don't remember the band. So in any case, so that's not much, right, directly related to Miraflores. But my hope, as a researcher as well with the West Side Preservation Alliance, is to be able to tell the story of the outgoing tentacles of Miraflores and how this Miraflores also represents the story of what we're calling Mexico de Afuera. So Mexico de Afuera is the group of Mexican nationals who moved here and made San Antonio their home, right? So it's just not like they were all, and so my interest is in the making San Antonio your home part, and what all of that entailed, and so I, as far as regarding the choices in the future and the significance of the garden, I really do think that the preservation and or restoration of the garden should rely heavily on good research, and that I don't see it so much as a celebration of the conquest, but rather kind of like making lemonade out of lemons. I mean, it's more like, okay, what came out of the conquest was our mestizaje. Let's celebrate that, So I think that's kind of different than, celebrating the conquest per se. And So research results, so I'm hoping that the research that is done can inform maybe a dedicated website, a brochure, something that will tell a really big story about Mexicanidad in San Antonio, and how Urrutia was part of that. So we all know that research results depend on the questions we ask, and so I'm interested, therefore, in the social history of Miraflores, right? It's wonderful. We need to know all about the artistic meanings, and all of the presentations so far have been tremendous, but especially as a member of the West Side Preservation Alliance, we kind of are interested in, well, like, how did that stream out into San Antonio proper? How did that stream out his interactions with San Antonio's West Siders, who we know from his Clínica and Farmacia Urrutia on Houston Street and Laredo Street. Those healthcare consultorios really served the West Side residents, especially. Of course, there were Mexican nationals who would travel because of his renown as a surgeon and a doctor to come seek services from him. But for the most part, he served the West Side. How does that all play out? And so some of my questions for the archives are somewhat like, how did Miraflores function in the social and cultural life of Mexicans of different socioeconomic groups? We hear that, yes, he was part of the elite. The elite attended. What were other sorts of peoples that interacted in his world? What people and communities had access to the gardens, and who participated in activities there? And how did the deseo to maintain and express an identity of Mexicanidad relate to the wider network in San Antonio? And one that I'm particularly interested in is during the mid and late 1920s, was the garden ever used or visited by the exiled Mexican Catholic clergy who were fleeing the political persecution of the Cristero War, and who were in fact living right across the street at the sisters-owned property of the George Breckenridge Villa? It is very well known that there were many Mexican bishops who lived there for quite some time. And so, in part of my research, I have seen from the time when Dr. Urrutia was still in Mexico, that these same bishops were writing him letters as the Minister of the Interior in that role. So I know they all knew each other. So these are the kinds of things that the social history fabric, I'd love to know, have further exploration of that. So here's a little story. One day in the archives that I work in, I saw this box of papers that had been sitting there, and I thought, okay, what is that? I'm finally going to check it out. And on the outside, it said, Papers of Mr. Andrés Garza Galán, 1911 to 1928. Received from Incarnate Word Mother House, and Mother House is another word for convent, October 1988. So, okay. And then another note on the side says, this suitcase came from Eagle Pass, Texas in 1958. So in the little bit of research I've been able to do about that, and in genealogical websites, and there's vital records inside the box as well of this man, Andrés Garza Galán. He was born in Coahuila, and he came to live in San Antonio, and he frequently traveled back and forth across the border for his international businesses. It seems that at times he was involved in the car business or the fruit business. I mean, he had his hands in a lot of businesses. And so one newspaper article I found revealed that Dr. Urrutia was dictating a letter to Andrés Garza Galán. So I thought, this is exciting. This helps me build a sense of the network that I'm looking for. And thank you, I got it. This article was from the San Antonio Light, June 3rd, 1915. And the title of the article is Dr. Urrutia Calls Wilson Note Error. So Dr. Urrutia was having some very strong opinions about President Wilson, some policy that President Wilson had just implemented, and Dr. Urrutia thought it was going to alienate Mexico and Mexicans. And so, and it says, Dr. Urrutia's comments on the president's note was dictated by him to Andres Garza Galan and translated by the latter. So I thought, this is an example of where you never know where research is going to lead you, and it's meant to be an encouragement to everyone to keep, dig deep. Don't assume like, okay, I found the end. And when you see a personage mentioned, research them. So I think the archives have a lot to tell us about the Mexico de afuera. And so I'll end with this. So we're currently doing, as part of the West Side Preservation Alliance, research on the Barrio Laredito, as I said. Most of it has been raised by 1970s urban renewal and the construction of the expressway. So, and so it begins really, as I said, east of the San Pedro, on the east with the San Pedro Creek going westward. So some of the places that are still with us are the hospital and Alameda Spanish language theater and Casa de Mexico. These are all super sites of Mexico de afuera. And so we need to dig in about them, those sites, and also the past Urrutia healthcare locations were right there, and the Zaragoza and Nacional Spanish language teatros were there. The Witt printing building belonging to Mexican national publisher and book distributor Gilberto Bonifacio Witt, and the Artes Gráficas printing building that used to be on Camarón Street, 115 to 117 Camarón Street. So Artes Gráficas was a publisher of Spanish and English publications, and also again lost through urban renewal. And just as a way to end and as a note to the focus of this symposium, in 1940 it published two books that I'm mentioning, that I will mention. One, the Pinacoteca book that John Phillip Santos let us see the inside of. And Pinacoteca means art gallery, and Dr. Urrutia was the author of that book. And the second book is by a journalist for La Prensa called Federico Allen Hinojosa, and his book is titled Mexico de afuera, and it's in Spanish. And it's a very interesting, smallish book, and it really talks about the kind of grief that a Mexican exile has to experience, and the constant longing for the Mexico that has been left behind. And so I thought that these were just mentioning the house, the publishing house, and these two publications would be an interesting way to end, just to spark everyone's imaginations about the whole world of Mexico de afuera that existed in San Antonio, Texas.
Thank you, Donna. One of the things that really sparks for me is thinking about how we can start to think about Miraflores as in relationship, of course, to the west side, to the historic west side. We've been talking today most about it in terms of the kind of north-south axis, but there's a very important east-west axis, right? And how turning our attention to this garden might also help turn our attention to the links that have historically existed in our city, and that we might bring to light in the parts of the city, also other parts that need more attention and more history, right, to bring into the center of the city. So thank you so much. Lynn, I will pass the microphone to you and just tell us about the Conservancy and its relationship to Miraflores today.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. I'd like to say that a lot has been going on through the years, moving up to modern times, since 2006, 2007, since the park has become part of the San Antonio Park system. And Patsy Light, who is here with us today, who wrote about Dionisio Rodriguez, as well as Elise, Dr. Urrutia, and the Urrutia family, have almost single-handedly kept the spotlight on Miraflores. She was driving down Hildebrand one day and saw some things going on that should have been going on. She involved Mayor Cockrell, and the upshot of this was the transfer of Miraflores property from Incarnate Word to the city. And I don't know if you know, but the lot where the pharmacy building is at the top of Stadium in Hildebrand, that piece of land was exchanged and given to Incarnate Word for Miraflores coming to the city. Conservation Society was deeply involved in this, and they are actually saving some of the remnants, the urns, the pillars. I know they're eager to get these things out of the warehouse, but we thank them for doing that. But I was struck by John Phillip's comment about Miraflores was improvised, because Brackenridge Park is improvised. We are all here in this location because of the San Antonio River and the springs. This is a story of water, not just Miraflores, but Brackenridge Park. And we can tell our history going back 12,000 years, and it's documented human habitation, and it's why we are here. So yes, Miraflores did flood, it floods now, it will continue to flood because of the springs there. But from the Conservancy's point of view, the Conservancy was formed in 2008, so we were newly involved at the time of the Miraflores becoming part of city parks. But Conservation Society actually helped form the Conservancy as an organization which would dedicate its commitment to the advocacy for the park. It's the only organization that does speak for Brackenridge Park. And so we have a management agreement with the City of San Antonio, and it allows us to give advice to the city. Bill gets tired of hearing from me. One of the goals is to bring Miraflores into the life of the city and to make it open to the public to enjoy. Interpretation, of course, is very important, but the garden itself, being outdoors, this is first and foremost in my mind so that people can enjoy it. And during COVID, there has been such an increase of people out in Brackenridge Park just wanting to connect to nature, lift our spirits, and I'm hoping this will become part of Miraflores too, the history that it will bring to Brackenridge Park. I want to say there's some other exciting things that will involve Miraflores, and we don't know where it's going to go at this point, but Incarnate Word and the Sisters and Headwaters Coalition are very involved in talking with the city and with Brackenridge Park Conservancy about how the university might use Miraflores, how students, how faculty can come and sit and be out in nature. And I know Dr. Urrutia had rooms that were created by shrubs and trees and plantings. It was almost, a catharsis to come into that space and to just sit and be. So I think that's very important that they are interested. There is conversation about how the park and Miraflores can be connected to the university, going under Hildebrand and connecting to the Blue Hole, the headwaters of the San Antonio River, in one direction, and then to the other direction through the campus, and then eventually connect to Almasdan, come down on the other side, and connect to the Howard Peak Greenway. You will be able to connect all of us through bicycle and walking to the central area of the city, and on south through the Mission Reach and through the Museum Reach and Mission Reach. So we are very aware of the importance of Miraflores, and I remember it growing up. I'm a San Antonian, older, and I do remember the archway that is now at Sama, and I did mention to Marion Ettinger how I covet it and would love for it to be back at Miraflores, and he nearly fainted. So don't know that that would happen, but I know there's new leadership at the museum, so one never knows. But the goal is to bring back many of these artifacts that are saved. And I'd like to just bring to your attention that we would like to accept other features, other structures, pedestals, urns, plates, anything that might have walked away from Miraflores to come back to Miraflores. We'd be happy to talk to you about that. I know Elise and I received a message from a woman that found a piece of the 8-foot columns on her ranch, and we went and got it. It is part of what the Conservation Society had saved. Dr. Urrutia gave us the rest of the entire column that was there. There were 4 of them originally that came from the Hildebrand Gate and entrance. And with the work that is going on, I don't want to steal Bill's thunder. He's going to talk a bit about what's happening right now. We are going to put those columns up. We have 2 full columns. If anybody knows where the other 2 are, I'd like to know. And that's being made possible by a grant from the Octagon Foundation. We thank them. It's been restricted, and now we're going to be able to use it. So very much Miraflores should be a part of the active park system of the city.
Thank you, and especially if you've seen Porfirio Diaz's head, and that can come back, let Lynn know. Yeah, right. Bill, if you want to fill us in on what's happening now?
Thank you. Excuse me. Glad to be here, and thanks for the invitation to come and speak with you guys. Bill Pennell with the Parks Department with the City of San Antonio. We are the owners of the property and have a great opportunity to continue to work on what it's going to become, and what we've done so far is with the acquisition of the property. We did hire RVK Architect way back in 2006, 2007 to start this process of trying to figure out what this master plan and what this park should be, and understand how it works with Brackenridge, how it works with everything going on here in San Antonio. So through that process, which was a public process, which we were able to get a lot of information from the family, from the public, and from other stakeholders to talk about what needs to happen there. And so through that process, there was some 4 main goals that kind of came up to this, and it's to develop a phased plan that respects the cultural and artistic heritage of Miraflores while restoring passive recreation spaces. It was to create a link that connects to Brackenridge Park. Also create an enjoyable, historically accurate period garden that reflects the pride shown that Dr. Urrutia showed from Mexico, and reflects the nature of the estate garden of this time. And then also, key, partner with various public agencies, private organizations, to enhance the garden's ongoing programming, funding, maintenance, and use, right? So we need to partner with others to help us go through this process. So since 2007, we had the master plan. The master plan went through its process and was approved. With that project, we also started the first phase of the park, which was providing that access to Brackenridge Park. So that first project connected Brackenridge Park with a bridge over the San Antonio River and connected the park, and then also started removing some of the pieces that are not in the period of significance. So at one point when the park transitioned to ownership, the park was modified. Things were changed, fill dirt was brought in, gravel was brought in. There were picnic pads and other things. There's a pool that's there that's not from the period of significance. So we've started that process of starting to remove some of those pieces that don't fall within the 1925 to 1962 period of significance. Secondly, with great help from the Conservation Society, we did some restoration of some Dionisio Rodriguez pieces, the grotto and the palapa bench, and we were actually able to move the palapa bench that was along the property line right next to the fence by the parking lot which is now the UIW property, and move that to an interior place in the park. Then shortly after that, we had the Broadway Corridor project, right? And that brought that drainage feature into the park as well. So with that project, there was some mitigation required, and we got about $1 million worth of restoration work done for that. So that work included restoration of the hollow stump gate, of the saguaro cactus. It did put back the stone walls and repaired stone walls on the northern side on Hildebrand. And then it also did the restoration for the entry gate and the columns. So we got to work on those and get those restored and secured and stabilized. Currently, we're working on the area where Dr. Urrutia's statue is. And with this project, we were able to turn Dr. Urrutia around to the bridge so you can see him as you're coming in from Brackenridge Park. We're still trying to finish up the circle walkways that are around that. Those are currently in construction. And then with this also comes some planting and irrigation. So the idea of what John was talking about, the planting that's going to happen, we're in the process of working that through and actually starting to install that probably here in the next couple of months. Starting to put some of the trees and plants back that were there. And understand, since I've been on the project in 2007, for various, different things of droughts and then wet times, there were times when we couldn't mow the park because the water was that high. And then there were times where we didn't need to mow the park because the grass wouldn't grow. So through that period, we've probably lost somewhere around 30 or 40 trees within that time period, which we will put back as we're starting to restore and bring the park back. So I did want to point out, the main focus, the master plan that gave us the guide as our principle, which went through a public process, also reflects, guidance from the Secretary of Interior's guidelines on the treatment of cultural landscapes. And the two main focuses on that is restoration. So we're trying to restore pieces from this period of significance, which once again is 1925 and 1962. And then reconstruction. And John was asking some great questions about that. And what it defines as reconstruction in those guidelines, though, is basically recreating a vanished or non-surviving landscape, but with new materials, right? So primarily for interpretive purposes. So they don't like us to try to recreate what was there, but to obviously the feature like the tower would have been a prominent and important aspect of the garden. So to look at trying to create that using different material. So that's what I have.
Thank you. So obviously, I want to actually come back to one of John's very important questions. I think is about the status of that 2007 plan and what maybe needs to be re-asked or brought into it anew, because it is now a bit old, right? And as we open up this conversation to maybe think more about if you could wave a magic wand, Lynn and Bill, and have what you want, what that might be in terms of resources, and also what a process moving forward might look like that would incorporate many of the things that we have been hearing about this morning, the stories that might connect it more completely into other parts of our city's history as well. And I do also just want to mention, sitting here in this beautiful garden, something John mentioned to me in the break is how important plants brought from, plants that were indigenous to Mexico, and of course also indigenous to San Antonio, where we haven't been talking about the plants so much, but obviously that's a critical piece of the garden. So there's a hugely rich horticultural aspect of this story that also is about a kind of broad set of connections. I would now open the floor to questions from any of you or responses that any of you all have to each other's remarks. Yeah.
Yes, thank you for this presentation. I have a question about the destruction of Miraflores. What causes it to be destroyed? What were the factors?
Okay. The question, thank you, was what caused the loss and destruction? How did this happen?
Well, unfortunately, Southwestern Bell acquired it, and then before it was turned into AT&T, and they used it for their pioneers or retirees, and they brought in a lot of fill and destroyed some of the important things, or they laid them down and covered them up. So I know Bill, every time he puts a shovel in, he finds something else, which we didn't know was there. And then when Incarnate Word acquired it, the attention was not given to it that it should have been, and other things were destroyed. I know one of the things was the fountain that you've seen the picture of. So we are working with the administration now, and Incarnate Word and the sisters, to help them understand the importance of what it is and what we can do there. Some I was mentioning in terms of restoration versus recreation, and what is the reality of that, because it will take a lot of money, but do we want to recreate something like the library building or the fountain? I'm not sure we do, or can we? So how do we interpret that in a way that the Department of Interior guidelines will allow us to? But it is important to remember what went before. We're all connected, and just to show you how much connection we have to us as human beings, I meant to introduce him earlier, but Mr. Santos is here today with a group of his family, and it was his father that created the Guatemoc statue, and you might have seen, where are you? Would you like to stand up, Mr. Santos? He has brought information forward about his memories. I told him we'd like to do a formal oral history. Elise, you might want to talk to him in more detail too. But again, his father came and lived in the Harlingen-McAllen area. This relationship of those from Mexico who fled and then stayed here. I know there are generations that have now grown up. How do we get them involved, not only in interest, but in philanthropy, and how we redo Miraflores? That would be important. And then, what else was then a Christian? Somebody else. You want to add something?
So in reference to this conversation, both in the master plan and currently through Elise, there are 62 objects that have been identified, and there's a map both in the master plan and in Elise's, and there's knowledge by Elise of some things that are not there. And so I think that's part of what happened, where did it go, and where does it come back. There is this inventory, and I think that's a very important component to try and reestablish and what they are, where they are. They vary. I find that very interesting. And the water and the drainage in this project is also a consideration in how we recreate something that's going to flood and or have.
Yes, you know, the recent rains we had at the first of the summer, the piers that were to be put in to support the columns that are going in, each time they tried to drill them, water was 3-4 feet high in those holes. So yes, that will be an ongoing conversation of how to deal with it. I wanted to say, this is what I meant when I looked at you. The master plan, when it was adopted in 2006, 2007, did envision more of a museum with pieces where it would be closed and opened up. And so we at the Conservancy certainly think that this master plan discussion should be broadened to discuss some of the things we've talked about today. It's not set in time, and of course the city is very much a part of this and willing to hear comments and discuss all of this with us. But just wanted to add that.
I'd just like to say it's important to learn about what plants we want to put back in there and the trees, and if we filled the soil, were those trees at that level, and will that affect the recreation and the restoration of the garden?
Yes, and Elise, if you have new pictures, I liked that one I hadn't seen with the plantings around Dr. Urrutia. I hope you'll give show Bill.
Thank you. So the question you asked was, what happened? Why do we not have this anymore? And I agree, Lynn gave some of the specific details of what happened, but I think at the root of all of it, what happened is a lack of understanding. And so what I've tried to do in my work is to give us a greater understanding of what is there, because when you look at it today, you cannot tell. You don't know what you're missing. So you don't know what was not there. You don't know what's not there today. And so I have tried to really look at what was there in 1920s, 1930s, 1940s, and understand the really complex, deep meaning behind these things, as John Phillip was really alluding to in his discussion. I think that we can't make assumptions based on what we see just currently. We really have to look back into what was there and understand what it means, because it's a very, the Mexican sensibility and the roots of Mexican culture are very different from what we experience now as American culture. But these things are rooted in San Antonio culture because San Antonio was Mexico. So it's something that we can deeply explore and make a connection to. The second thing I want to comment on is the Sanchez family. In my book, there's an entire chapter on Cuauhtémoc and Luis Sanchez, which is based on research from the Sanchez family, not Gabriel's branch of the family, but I did speak directly with other members of the family to help me understand who Luis Sanchez was. And very fortunately, a lot of what you provided with the Conservancy is what I have already learned in my book and is written down and will be published in that book. So be assured that your family's legacy is well represented in my book, and you can actually see that. I published the San Antonio Report, published an excerpt of my book on the Cuauhtémoc statue, I think yesterday or the day before. So there's an excerpt, and that's the excerpt they chose, was the Cuauhtémoc statue, because it was the first statue in the garden. And then I have a companion piece that also appears in my book on my website that talks about the artist, about Luis Sanchez himself. So I was very excited to be in touch with your relatives after I wrote a 2016 article. They got in touch with me and we connected, and I learned all about him, and that was one of the big thrills of writing my book, was learning his story.
I also just want to draw attention to the attention that John Phillip placed on the power of absence and of what is broken. And we are dealing with a lot of broken and absent things, and that might be a valuable framework to bring into. And I'm also very much struck by the parallels with historic Tenochtitlan of flooding and drought, And the Mexica, the Aztecs lived with that. They built a city around that, and we have a lot to learn about how to build differently with climate, as we know. Tomás.
I want to thank all panelists for a wonderful discussion today. A couple of things that I would like to mention. One is that we should not forget that San Antonio is a minority-majority city. And the majority culture, of course, is the Mexican-American culture. So I think that in every single aspect, this community is very much part of Miraflores. And that one important thing might be to have an educational component, so that a lot of the people that are here, whose heritage is embedded in the sculptures and the plantings and the whole story, so that they could also understand part of their history, which is not taught in the school. So one important thing would be an educational component. It would have docents who would also be trained to tell the story, the other part of the story, to complete the meaning of what San Antonio culture really is about. Donna's discussion, I think, was very pertinent to that notion of El México de afuera. But it's not only El México de afuera that's here, it's the Mexican-American community that was here predated El México de afuera. And so a lot of discussions. One important thing would be to do oral histories with a lot of the people about the working class community in San Antonio, because memory is very, very important. I wrote a preface for the book in which I talked because Dr. Aureliano Urrutia was a doctor de cabecera of my grandfather. So a lot of people remember who he was. A lot of people remember him going to Mass at San Fernando Cathedral. There's a lot of memory that has to be woven into the story of Miraflores, so that it's not only the high European culture that was there, which is also a part of us, but also the working class community in San Antonio. A lot of the artifacts, for example, the mosaics, the torn mosaics, were the kind of things that people used when they built graves and so on in San Antonio. So the artistic part of it is also related to working class community, working class memories. And so I'm saying this because the future is for all these people to make those connections so that we can then have a sort of a better democratic society, a more inclusive culture, which we want San Antonio to have, instead of a separation of cultures, to sort of have a composite of cultures. And part of that composite is the Mexican-American community. So I'm arguing that I hope this Mexican-American component becomes a part of all the aspects of the next phase of the Miraflores. Thank you.
And I would just say that it's such a central point, right? And goes to the question of what to do with the interior standards and the period of significance problem, because it leaves out too much, right? And particularly your wonderful observation about the graffiti, right? That is a post-77, but that is part of the story now, right? That's someone is responding exactly as Tomás says.
And the nature of that graffito, that it was about how justice never comes.
Exactly. And
just one other note, just both on Tomás's remarks and Ed's question before, on this question of destruction. You know, it's so much of a piece with so much of the Mexicano-built environment of San Antonio's tradition that went under the wrecking ball. Beginning in the 1930s, really, the erasure of that legacy that Tomás refers to here. You know, I'm reminded of this passage in Frederick Law Olmsted, you know, the creator of Central Park, his account of coming to San Antonio in the late 19th century, and he talks about San Fernando Cathedral, and he says San Fernando Cathedral is glowering down upon him with this accusatory presence. You know, an architect, you know, a landscape genius, saw the buildings of our city's past as accusatory. And I wonder to what extent Miraflores became a presence that was uncomfortable for the neighborhood it's in. I wonder also how a place like Quinta Urrutia could be torn down. You know, something that looks like a national architectural jewel. But the mindset was in a place where those things weren't given a second thought.
I might like to add that now that the bridge will be connected to Miraflores, we do want to begin giving tours and to have a program where we can all understand be docents to tell people the rest of the story. There are other areas of Miraflores that will not be safe to walk through, but we can certainly come over the bridge, which now will be connected, and go up to the gateway at Hildebrand and be able to have panels and take, talk more about what we could do there.
Antonia.
I'm wondering if there is a way of accessing the research of the information on who the workers were. Were they workers from the west side? Who built it? Whose labor built it? That does not take away from Dr. Urrutia, but I am wondering this broader question about the labor that built Miraflores.
Well, there were certainly a number of people who did the work that he wanted to have done there. There's no question about that, and I'm certain that they were West Side San Antonians. One company that he worked with and this is where Luis Sanchez had his first job, was an organization called Rodriguez Brothers. And I don't know if anybody remembers Rodriguez Brothers, but they were a West Side organization that primarily made concrete cemetery memorials. And this is very much in the Mexican tradition. You know, the cemeteries in Mexico City and Monterrey have these marvelous concrete structures. And Rodriguez Brothers was doing that in San Antonio. I would suspect that many of the concrete structures that you see in San Fernando Cemetery were created by them. So Luis Sanchez worked for Rodriguez Brothers, by the way, unrelated to Dionisio Rodriguez. Those two are they are not relatives of each other. So we do know that Rodriguez Brothers contributed employees and manual labor to the construction of some of the works at Miraflores. And to the extent that I can find out more about all of that, I'm very interested in it.
Yes, in fact, in some of the WPA, West Side Preservation Alliance, research that we've done, Rodriguez Brothers, I think they're still existing, and but in those days, they were located in Cattleman Square on Houston Street, and right almost next door was the first Henry Guerra Angelus funeral home. So, businesses move all over, but, we love to map things at the WPA, so I just thought I'd mention that.
So, we unfortunately are coming to the end of our time in this space. This is a conversation that needs to keep going, not just in a few minutes on the grass out there, but I hope in other venues when we have more time and can go into this, we have begun to scratch the surface. I want to just say what I have heard today, sorry, this is Professor O'Rourke coming in, the need for oral histories, the need to revisit the 2007 master plan and possibly the National Register application to extend the period of significance, the centrality of foregrounding education going forward about Mexican-American San Antonio and the San Antonio as a whole, the importance of building connections across neighborhoods, across communities, imagining new maps of San Antonio, mapping what is here and what is not here and what could be, the centrality too of thinking about horticulture and plants and ecology and flooding and what our river means, the tremendous value of archives and what we haven't even begun to uncover, the importance of learning about a history that is 500 or more years old today and is far but also very near. And of course, the one thing that we have not talked about, but which is completely obvious, is the great need to pay for all of this, right? To fund this. And that might be a topic for a future conversation. I want to thank most of all our panelists, our speakers. Thank you, thank you, thank you. This has been wonderful. And all of you for being here. I'm sorry we don't have time for more questions, but please keep them coming. Let's keep it going. So, happy Saturday. Be well.